are listening to Setting History Straight with Linda Watson on Hebrew Nation Radio.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about the Protestant Reformation. And really and truly, we're going to try to pull all the events together that was going on in Europe around the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. We're going to basically talk about the Protestant Reformation during that time frame. The historians left out, like I said, this critical piece of history. And the history that's left out is the religious history that they keep wanting to push into the background. So everybody at that time in Europe, like I said, was keeping the seventh-day Sabbath almost to the 12th century. And this is something people don't know. And that was the big battle that was going on between the churches. The Catholic Church was keeping Sunday, and the Celtic Church and the Assyrian Church, which was in the eastern part of Europe, was keeping, and even into Russia, was keeping Saturday Sabbath. And so it was not the picture that people are being portrayed. And so we need to understand that background before we get into the Protestant Reformation teaching, because it plays a major role, even though the historians have left it out. Now let's go through this. Gildas, who was a historian in the 3rd, 4th century, wrote this: the Britons are contrary to the whole world, enemies of the Rome usage, not only in mass. Along with the Jews, they serve the shadows of things to come rather than the truth. See, they weren't following Catholic doctrine. They weren't Catholic. He goes on, it says that they derive their customs, such as Easter, from a time when the church was Judaizing in all things. So he's really laying it out there for you that the Celtic Church was not following the traditions of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, they began to start having their teachings changed by the Catholic Church. And this started with Margaret of England, who married Malcolm the Great, the Scottish king, in 1067. Now, Margaret was a Catholic, and she wanted to change the Celtic Church, and she called the church leaders together to discuss it. At last, with the authority of the king, she used her husband. She managed to turn the ancient Celtic Church in Scotland away from the Sabbath. That is the life of Margaret by Turgot, who wrote the history of Margaret. So this, you can see here that these people were still keeping the Sabbath up until the 11th century, almost the 12th century. And in Scotland, they were keeping it in Britain, they were keeping it in Scotland, and they were keeping it in other places too, in Ireland. We're going to look at that. Going on here, this is a Catholic historian. He wrote, in this manner, the Scots were perhaps keeping up the traditional use of the ancient Irish church, which observed Saturday instead of Sunday as the day of rest. So this is a really big deal, because when they leave this out of history, these people don't know in this country that their ancestors kept the Saturday Sabbath up until the 12th century. That's a very big piece of history to leave out. Now, this is Ireland, and they were keeping the Sabbath up until the 12th century again. You can see 1153. It's Henry II who would become the King of England. He was actually from France. He made an agreement. He brought his army in. He made an agreement with the bishops. I'm going to read this. The bishops agreed to the union with the Church of England. Then Henry, to suit his own ends, handed over the Irish church to the Pope of Rome. Now, in red here, the fate was sealed when the Archbishop arrived, visiting Dublin in 1172. So he turned the church over in Ireland to the Catholic Church, and this would actually begin what we call the Dark Ages, because now people's ideas and their beliefs were going to be suppressed by the Catholic Church and the actual governments at that time. So they were all in this together to suppress free thought. And so, like I said, this is the Dark Ages. Now, we also have a quote here from Truth Triumphant, and it basically talks about Wales and how long they kept the Sabbath. It tells you they kept it until 1115, when the first Roman bishop was seated at St. Davis Church, the old Welsh Sabbath-keeping churches. Not even then, although altogether, rode to the knees of Rome. So even though that they were forced into it, most people hid some of their beliefs and continued to do what they had done for centuries, and it was just hid. And we can get into more of this history because I'm going to talk about the Dark Ages in a different show. But we're going to now get into this story about the Protestant Reformation. This eventually all fell to Rome, and Rome took over all the religions in Europe. And this is basically where, this is the history that we are going to pick up from, is right in this part of time. So the Ottoman Empire was beginning to push its way in that 15th century. And we also had, this is how it actually came in. It came in looking something like this. They started pushing themselves in around the 1300s, and they took over Constantinople. They took over Constantinople, then you know that Rome fell. The Byzantine Empire would have fallen. Okay, and so this was basically what caused the Protestant Reformation, because they were pushing people out of these areas when they came in, and they were pushing them into Europe. And these people had been keeping God's laws, many of them, throughout the centuries. So when they came into Europe, they were not going to go under Catholic rule. That's exactly what was going on. And this would be what we really call the Renaissance period, because the Renaissance period was actually the time that people began to move away from Catholicism and into the Protestant faith. So, okay, and there was many different types of that, but characterized by a revival and no longer a suppression of ideas, because the people had been suppressed all that time. And so the Renaissance really was a result of these people being pushed out of the eastern part of Europe into that area. Now, remember in Scripture, all the churches that were mentioned in the New Testament were in Eastern Europe. And so this is the remnants of the people that were in those churches. It would be called the old Assyrian church. We know that they were keeping the Saturday Sabbath until the 10th century, because we know that Leo IX sent an excommunication order to Michael Celarius in the Eastern Old Assyrian church and excommunicated him for not fasting on Saturday. So we know that, and we know that they were still keeping it. So how much of that was going on, it's really hard to know. They began to push themselves into Europe, and they weren't going to go under Roman rule. They were not going to go under Roman rule. So that would start around the 1300s, is the Renaissance period. Now, some other things that was causing the Protestant Reformation was the Black Death. Now, the Black Death had been going on and off in Europe for a long time, but it had never came to Western Europe until the 13th century. So around 1346, 47, you had this 4-year period, and it was from 1347 to 1351. And that was the period in Europe where the Black Plague had moved in, and it killed 1/3 of the people in Europe at that time. So people thought that the end of the world had come. Do y'all understand that? When they saw 1/3 of the people die in Europe, they said, oh my goodness, it must be the end of the world. Now, interesting date, because 1351, I have that in red there for a reason, because this is the year that John Wycliffe is ordained. And John Wycliffe came out of England. He was educated in Oxford. Very interesting, because he would truly be the first person to start the Protestant Reformation. Now, it had been going on for centuries before that. There had been this fight between Rome and the Christians that had been going on since the time of the Messiah, right? But this man right here told the people, you need to come out of the Catholic Church. You need to start keeping the Old Testament. You need to leave the Catholic religion and its beliefs. You need to start keeping the holy days. He kept the holy days and the Sabbath. So this is very interesting, because you see how God chooses people that are keeping his laws to bring the movements and bring the change. And so he was brought up on charges by the Catholic Church. When he did, all his followers left because they didn't want to be excommunicated, and they didn't want to be persecuted. So they just left him. So he was just by himself. And before the Catholic Church could get there to actually put him on trial, he died. And they actually dug up his bones and ground them up and poured them in the Thames River. That's how much they hated John Wycliffe. And John Wycliffe, you remember, wrote the first English Bible. He must have wrote more than one copy, because there was a copy found in Scotland also that was talked about how they buried actually in a barn. This man, how interesting is that? Soon as this plague finishes, this man's ministry starts. And he would influence all these people in Europe. One of his followers was a man named Jan Hull, and sometimes they call him John Hull. He was one of the followers. So he would have been, do y'all see that he would have been keeping the holy days and Torah and keeping God's laws also? Do y'all see that? So he would have been a believer. Now, he would be the one that would start the movement in Bohemia. Now, Bohemia is located in the Czech Republic, okay? And it is, at that point in history, 3 out of every 4 people in Bohemia was a Protestant. That's what influence this man had. Now, you also, at time, that Martin Luther was beginning to come to and do what he wanted to do, but this happened way before Martin Luther. You see that his date, now he would be burned at the stake because of his beliefs, and they took Wycliffe's books and used them as kindling to start the fire. And his last words is, he said, in 100 years, God will raise up a man. Call for reform can't be suppressed. And that was about 100 years later, be Martin Luther come on the scene. So God actually used this man to witness to these people at this point. Now, at that point, you had England, who had already been exposed to leaving the Catholic Church and starting a Reformation. And now you had Bohemia that had already started with the Reformation. And now you're going to get to a man named John Colet. And he was obviously French, but his father was the mayor of London. And so he had a lot of power. If you'll notice on the side here, this is the St. Paul's Cathedral in London. In 1496, he went into the church and he read the New Testament to the people in English. That had not been done in any church in over 300 years. And it says that the people for 6 months, they would fill that entire church. I think this may be the same church that Princess Diana and Charles got married in. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's the same church. It's a humongous church. And as many as 20,000 people would stand out and listen to him read. And they actually thought they were hearing heresy. They said, this has got to be heresy because we never heard this in our churches before. And so all he was doing was actually just reading. So the people were beginning to be stirred by it because of the Black Plague, because you had a new influx of people who were not willing to go under the Catholic faith. So you had a lot going on. And so the people were beginning to start, leaving the Catholic Church and wanting to form their own churches. One of the reasons for that is the printing press. The printing press was created. This is a replica of what it looked like. And this happened about this same time because now people could actually start printing the Bible and read it. Now, keep in mind that nobody knew how to read back then. So now not only did they get a Bible, the Bible was not just, it wasn't just for spiritual understanding. It was how they learned how to read, because the majority of people didn't know how to read. So this was created in 1436. Now, Johannes Gutenberg, he was credited with actually creating it, but someone had done it and he had bought it from him. But he basically was credited for it. And this printing press that they would produce the new Bibles on. Now, this is the very first Bible, a picture of the very first Bible ever printed. It was printed in Greek. Erasmus was the one that compiled it. They said he was in such a hurry to do it, he would print a page and write a page and print a page and write a page until it got it done. And he was under terrible pressure from the Pope, because the Pope wanted him to put a scripture in there about the Trinity. And so I think in one of his translations, he actually did it because he was under so much pressure to do this. And so he created what we call the received text. And this is called the received text. This is not the same as the Catholic Bible. It was the Bible translations that had come through Europe into Scotland, Ireland, in those areas. And that's what he actually translated from. He did not translate from the Catholic Bible. Now, Tyndale would produce his Bible in 526, and that would be an English Bible. And then Martin Luther would do one in 1534. Now, Martin Luther would be the one that tacked everything on the wall, if you remember. Now, in 1432, the Byzantine Empire fell. That was in May 29th. It only took them 53 days. When they began pushing in, like we said before, the people began to move and migrate out. The people began to migrate into Europe in large numbers because that would bring in that restoration that we've been talking about. Now, Tyndale had a controversy with one of the kings of England. He actually printed the first English Bible. And so he translated it and he had it printed because they had the printing press. And then they were able to sell because people really wanted these Bibles. Now, he got into a skirmish, I think, with Henry VIII, if I'm not mistaken. And then next on the scene would be Calvin, John Calvin. That would be around 1536. He would go into Switzerland, and he kept getting pushed out of all the places that he would go in. He first preached in Geneva. He was actually French, by the way. He came out of France. He went into Geneva to preach. The council didn't like his ideas, so they expelled him. So he eventually went to a place called Strasbourg in France also, and he became the minister of the church there. Now, he would be the man that would pull all the Protestants together. he was a fighter. He was a real fighter. Many of the teachings now that are in our churches, as well as in the Protestant churches, came from John Calvin. You know, he believed in predestination. The Bible is infallible. He believed that we get all our strength and power from God. See, the Catholic Church didn't teach any of those things. And so interesting, many of his teachings have gone into the churches today, but he was the real powerhouse to pull the people together. Before that, there just wasn't, you know, there was no real heart to the movement. But he was the true heart to the movement. And the Protestant faith would flourish, was coming about here. And the Catholic Church and the Roman Empire did not want it. Now, this is a picture right here of, you know, John Calvin. And like we said before, now in Scotland, you had a Reformation going on there also at the same time. Around this same time, you had James V of Scotland. He marries Mary Guise of France. She came from an extremely wealthy family in France. They had a lot of influence. We'll talk about her family a little later. And he dies at the age of 30. And Mary, Queen of Scots, is his daughter. And she's the only heir to the throne because he didn't have any other heirs. And so because she was so little, Scotland decided that they would use a council to govern the people. And the queen, who was Mary Guise, which was James V's wife from France, she would be the one that would really have control over that council. And like I said, she governs Scotland until Mary would be old enough. Now, she worked real hard to be able to marry the Prince of France to her daughter, which was Mary, Queen of Scots. No, they would marry. And you know, that would be James VI, who would be the one that would sit on the throne in England, okay? Now, really important because she was pushing heavy to keep the Catholic faith in Scotland. And she will double cross her people at some point and sign some documents to turn Scotland over to France. Now, the reason they were so tied to France is because France would come in and help them to fight the English, because the English wanted to take control of Scotland, and Henry VIII wanted to marry in one of his daughters into the line in Scotland, and he wanted one of the daughters in the royal family to marry his son Edward. Well, you remember Edward was a real sickly son, and he didn't live long after he became king. He did not manage to be able to marry into that line. The reason he wanted to marry into that line is he wanted a legal way to control Scotland. They used the French to bring in the troops to help them fight the English. And so it was always a battle between Scotland and the English, and still is today, really. Now, there would be a Protestant leader. His name was Patrick Hamilton, and he wrote a book called Patrick's Places. It was a book teaching people about the Bible, and of course the Catholic Church did not like this at all, and they actually burned him at the stake. And what was sad about this is it took him 6 hours to die when he was burned at the stake. I just think that's terrible, and the people of Scotland were just outraged. And so Mary Guise, she put an edict in. Well, we all know what edicts are because we get those all the time from our president. It's the same thing. And she told them on May 12th, 1559, I'm going to shut down all the Protestant churches. And so she's put this edict out. And the day before, on May 11th, John Knox was allowed to preach and he preached in a church in Perth. It was called St. John's Church. And he moved the people so much with his sermon. I'm telling y'all, I know he wasn't politically correct person. Now you can be assured of that. He was not politically correct, because when he finished speaking, the congregation jumped up from their seats. They ran up to the front of the church. They threw all the idols and statues out in the street. They broke all the stained glass windows. Then they went down the street. They went and destroyed the palace in Perth, the monasteries in Perth, tore all the glass, took all the statues out, all the glass windows, and went to Scone and did the same thing, took down the abbey, took down the monasteries, took down the churches. You know, and this was really an answer to what Mary Guise was trying to do, and that they were not going to have it. And it's interesting that the day that they chose to have this sermon was on a Saturday. Now, you know, I mean, I just think it's interesting. We don't have a lot of history from that time to know how many people were actually believers at that point. You know, we don't have that history. Now, in 1553, Queen Elizabeth's sister, Mary Tudor, became the first female monarch. She was called Bloody Mary. She switched the faith in England back to Catholicism. Remember that Henry VIII would have been Protestant, and then she switched back to Catholic, switched the monarchy back to Catholic, and she burned 280 Protestants at the stake. You know, so usually before they burned them, by the way, they would usually strangle them, because that was more humane than to let them burn alive at some of these executions. Now, her reign was short-lived, thank God, and in came Queen Elizabeth, which we know at this point, this is when England, who was just a small country, considered a small country at that time, came to her true power under this woman. Now, she pushed in, however, in 1559, the Act of Uniformity, which meant everybody had to go to church on Sunday. Now, this was going to be a real problem, because this is the reason the Pilgrims left out of England and went into Holland, because Holland was this place that was a refuge for the people. So, you know, she pushed this in, and she had complete control over the churches. And then you would see 1607, the Pilgrims were moved to the Netherlands, somewhere around that time. They tried to go 3 or 4 times, and they would get caught and put in prison. And then one trip, the men had gotten on the boat, and the authorities were coming, and the women hadn't got on the boat yet, and they took off in the boat and left the women on the side of the shore. I guess they didn't really have a choice. So they took the women back to prison, and when the women got out of prison, then they finally got their access to be able to go into the Netherlands. And even when James VI came to reign on this English throne, the first time a Scottish king would reign on an English throne. And so when that happened, he was still writing letters to the Prime Minister of Holland saying, please send these people back. Now, I want to talk about them just a little bit here, a little later. So we'll get back to them. But now we're going to switch back to France now. So we know what's going on in England. We know what's going on in Scotland. And back to France now. This is where the heart of the thing was in France. And the people were so empowered that they made big signs, and they put the signs up everywhere. I don't know what the signs said, but they even tacked one of them to the bedroom door of the king's house. Of the king, actually the king, I think it was King Francis I, they attacked it to his bedroom door. So they were really stirred at this point. There was such a stirring of the people, and they were not going to shut down. And we all talked about some of this when we talked about the 30 Years' War, right? Because in the 30 Years' War, we saw that was a battle between the Catholics and the Protestants in Bohemia. So if y'all hadn't heard that, go back and listen to it, because that tells you everything that was going on in Bohemia. So in this place called Strasbourg, it was considered a free area, and they organized what they called the Reformed Church. And the people that were the believers in France were called the Huguenots. In 1555, they formed their first church in Paris, okay? So you can see some of the stuff that's going on here. They were pushing hot and heavy. They were under the influence of John Calvin, which we've talked about. He pulled this thing together. That's why it was so important. And so then they made a big mistake. They kidnapped the son of the king, or tried to. And this led to them being put to death, actually. So there was so much persecution against these people that now they began to start migrating themselves into America. Let's talk about this. So John Ribault was sent to North America for France. He took 150 French Huguenots, and they landed near Jacksonville, okay? And where Jacksonville is today, that's where they landed. They created this port. It was Charles Fort. So this, for some reason, this settlement just didn't work out. It didn't pan out. So that was the first one that came in. Then in 1564, a second one came in, and they also settled in Carolina. And that's in the northeast part of Fort Carolina, the northeast part of Florida. Now, at this point, this is when the Catholic Church became involved, and the government of France. And so they sent this man named de Villiers of Spain, and he arrived in Florida with 10 ships, 1,500 men, and he settled in St. Augustine. Everybody hears this history. They hear this history. Okay, but they don't include it in the history with America because they don't want people to know this. Now, he marched up to Fort Carolina, and he killed all of those people. That entire settlement of Huguenots, he killed them. And I'm going to read you what it says here. It says, Mendes took the fort and had some of the Frenchmen hung from trees with a message carved in the tree trunk that read, "Hung not as a Frenchman, but as a Lutheran." So this was a religious thing that they did. They did this because they were trying to rid the Huguenots. Do y'all see? This is why the people began to migrate into America. In fact, I watched a simple little show this week, and they referenced the town of Bradford. And they said that particular town had been started by somebody who escaped and wanted religious freedom. So there's many stories like that in New England, but we don't really know them because it's never been advertised. But this is what we call the Outcast of Israel. These were the people that were being outcast. And if you don't know what an outcast are, you're one of them, you know. So that's truly what's going on today. I'm going to read you some verses here about the outcast, because as the Father was allowing the Protestant Reformation to push the people out of that area into a place where they could actually have religious freedom. Of course, we know what's going on today. We are losing all those freedoms. Now, Jeremiah 30, verse 17, "For I will restore health unto thee, and I will heal thee of thy wounds, said the Lord, because they called thee an outcast, saying, "This is Zion, whom no man seeks after." Now, Zion is in reference, okay, to Israel. And so that's just another name for Israel. So when you see the word Zion, that's kind of synonymous with the name Israel, okay? But he says, these people are outcasts. So do we understand that the people that settled this country were the outcasts? And scripture is really referencing them right here, because the outcast is what started this country. Now, going on, it says, now this is for a future day, Isaiah 34, verse 8, "For it is the day of the Lord's revenge," which is really a day as a year, right? "And a year of recompense for the controversy against Zion." So there's something that comes against Zion. There's something that comes against Israel. Do y'all see that? That's going to bring the revenge of the Father. Now, going on, Jeremiah 8, verse 19. This is where it ties it back to America. This is where it ties it back to America in this verse. "Behold the voice of the cry of the daughter of my people, because of them that dwell in a far country. Is not the Lord in Zion?" Is not the Lord in Israel? Do y'all see that? "Is not her king in her?" So this goes back to Matthew 21, when it says the wine dresser, the person who owns the wine vineyard, leaves out and goes into a far country. And he says, the daughter, which is the descendants of my people. So the descendants of Israel would go into this far country. Do y'all see this? Now, is it possible that they're talking about America here? And yes, I would think so. And it says, "Why have you provoked me to anger with your graven images?" That's your sins and your strange vanities. And this is talking about the nation. He says, "You provoke me with your sins." Actually, that's what he's saying. All right, so verse 50, verse 28, "The voice of them that flee and escape out of the land of Babylon." Now, we know that in prophecy, we play the role of Babylon. America plays the role of Babylon because she is the hammer of the earth. We're told that in Isaiah chapter 47, Jeremiah 50, and Jeremiah 51. It talks about this place that's being compared to Babylon. That's the policeman of the earth. And it says they are the hammer of the earth. So we are the people that are the hammer of the earth. We're the policemen of the earth. And so it says that the people flee out of that land, Babylon, to declare in Zion the revenge of the Lord our God, the revenge of his temple. We are the temple. So we're the ones that are going to be outcast again. Do y'all see that? We're going to be the outcast. Our ancestors that came here, that started this country, were the outcast. We're going to be the outcast in the future. So this thing is repeating itself. And so I'm going to show you some more verses and show how this ties to Babylon. "I will render unto Babylon all the inhabitants of Chaldea, all that their evil that they have done in Zion in the sight of the Lord." And verse 35, "And the violence done to me and to my flesh be unto Babylon." The word flesh, by the way, roots down to the word choice. They're going to take our choices away. "Shall the inhabitants of Zion say, my blood is upon the inhabitants of Chaldea." So he's tying this place called Zion, do y'all see that? Back to this place called Babylon. Because the people that are Israel are in Babylon. That's why he's tying it back there. Do y'all see that? So interesting stuff. And now look at this. "Set up a standard upon the wall of Babylon, make the stronghold, and set up the watchmen," that's us, "prepare the ambush." In other words, we are the ones that are going to tell people it's coming. "For the Lord has has both devised and done that's what he has spoken against the inhabitants of Babylon. So we're going to prepare the ambushes. That means we're going to tell the people ahead of time that it's going to happen, which we'll talk about that again real soon, believe me. Now, getting back to the history on this, these people left out and came to North Carolina and South Carolina, really, before this big event that happens in 1572, which is the Battalion Massacre. So it was a special Catholic holiday that they had set aside. And so what's going to happen here is this, okay? Now, these are your four players. All right, the woman that you see right here, she is the king's mother. She meets with her council members who are Italian, and they put together a plot to kill all Protestants. She goes to her son that night, who is, his name, I think, is Charles IX. And she talks her son into killing the leader of the Protestant movement in that area. And his name was Coligny. Okay, and that's him right here. They went in at night, pulled him out of the bed, and killed him right there. Now, the family that did this was the Guys. This is the same people that Mary Guys came from, who had married into the line of James. She married James V. So this is the family, and this is a very evil family. And after this event that night, he had an army, and they went through France, and they killed just thousands and thousands of people. They said that as many as 30,000 may have died in the next 2 days, because they went from place to place, just killing everybody that they could find that was a Protestant. So you see that the Father had already taken many of the people out before, and I'm sure some of those people were true believers that he'd taken out, and they had no chance at all. You have to realize when they came to America, there was nothing there. There was no Winn-Dixies, and there's no grocery stores, and there's no Home Depots. That you had to build everything from scratch. So if you wanted a home, you had to build it from scratch. You had to raise your own gardens, or you didn't eat. So this was not a cakewalk. If many of these people may have came out of the cities, they may have not had those skills. And so it was a hardship for them, So they went to a place where nobody's taken care of. That absolutely nobody's taken care of them. But they made it out before this great slaughter that these four people were involved in. And it's important for y'all to know that this same mentality that these people have right here, which is to control people, which is what they wanted to do. They wanted to control people. That same mentality is going on in this nation today. The mentality is there. And so, I want to talk about this verse, and it's really an important verse. And it's Ezekiel 16, verse 27. It says, "Behold, therefore I will stretch out my hand over you and have diminished thy ordinary food," that word food is added, "and deliver thee unto the will of them that hate you." Please understand that the liberal people in this country truly hate us. And, and they hate the conservative people too, but they truly hate the religious people. And so this evil spirit is well underway in our country. It's an evil spirit that's been suppressed for many years, but now they have this opportunity and time to actually do quite a bit of damage. And this is what I'm saying. please understand that the people themselves, the people themselves in this country are just as evil, and they will do the same kind of thing to us if the Father allows that to happen. Now, meantime, the Pilgrims have now moved into Europe, and they're in the area of the Netherlands, which is at peace at this time because it was a refuge area. And William Bradford would come on the scene. Now, William Bradford, he had a terrible life. I mean, his mother died when he was a small baby. Then he lived with his uncle who died. And then he lived with a third relative. And so he's just a little kid, and he's been drugged from one place to another because there's nobody to take care of him. And so he gets involved with this Sabbath day group. It's an actual Sabbath day group. I'm going to put this up here so y'all can see this. I want you to see the names at the bottom down here. Do you see Robert Brown, John Greenwood? If you get a chance, go look up these names of these people, and you would find out that they all had Seventh-day Sabbath keeping churches. But these people were true believers. They were true believers, and they were separatists. You can see this, separating themselves from the church in England, which was very similar to the Catholic Church. The only difference is the king was controlling it. And they were Calvinists, you see there? But many of them, the Puritans were Calvinists, and, they considered themselves separatists, but they formed a church called the Congregationalist Church, which we will at some time talk about this church, because that is a foundational church that came up during that early time period in America that nobody talks about because they were keeping the holy days. This church right here was keeping the holy days. So, that's why they don't mention anything when it comes to the history of America. They mention a little bit about the Pilgrims, a little bit about the Puritans. They're not telling you who these people were that actually came to this country and what they believed. I mean, it's just so plain and so blatant, so that, and you can look at some of these names here. You can look every one of them up and find out they would not go to church on Sunday. This man right here, William Bradford, went to jail 6 or 7 times, and because he would not go to church on Sunday. And this was under Queen Elizabeth, because she had put in the Conformity Act, remember? Then we've already talked about around that same period of time, 1618 to 1648, is the 30 Years' War. And that war was the war when Ferdinand, who was the emperor of Bohemia, and he was a Habsburg, and Habsburgs were the people that persecuted. They were the governmental system in Europe, in Austria, and in Spain, and they were pushing the Catholic faith. And this is what we're talking about here. And they would eventually win this war. The Protestants took them 30 years, but they won this war. And this war resulted in more than 5 million deaths. I mean, it's hard to believe this. This is a huge, huge, big deal. All right, now, in 1680, many more of the second time, this is now more Huguenots are now beginning to move, and y'all can see why. They moved in an area called Jamestown on the Sanfee River north of Charlestown. 1684, they had an edict called Nates. This really pushed in the Catholic faith. French lost more than 400,000 into the Protestant inhabitations. Harassment was just rampant in the country at that point because they were pushing in hard to keep the Catholic Church. All right, now So now we've finished the overview of the history in Europe and what was going on. And now you see why these people were trying to get to America, because they were trying to avoid this persecution that was coming in England and in Scotland and in Europe. And now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about Ethiopia. Now, this is amazing history right here. And at the same time that the Ottoman Empire was pushing its way into Eastern Europe, into that area around Constantinople, right? When it was pushing its way in, it was also pushing its way into the area called Ethiopia. And now you can look in the map here, and I'll put an arrow there so you can see where Ethiopia is. And it connects right there to the Indian Ocean. You can see that. And you can see over here where it's located, you would have this connection that comes down here into the Indian Ocean. So they're pretty far east side of Africa, right? And so the background of these people, in the 1500s, the Muslim kingdom attacked Ethiopia. They were trying to push their way in, and this was an Islamic caliphate, and they fought hard against the Ottoman Turks. So eventually what happened is that the people in Ethiopia actually contacted the king of Portugal, and Portugal sent aid to these people. So they arrived, the people from Portugal arrived to help them. Now, when they arrived, they did help them defeat some of the Muslims out of that area and keep this caliphate from happening. The whole problem is that they brought in the Jesuits, because Portugal was again a Catholic state. Okay, Portugal was a Catholic state. So when they got a toehold, they brought the Jesuits in. Now, the man that came in was Vasco da Gama's son. And, you know, he was killed and beheaded in the battle, but he was trying to rescue these people that were Ethiopians. Now, Ethiopians at that point were still keeping the holy days and the Sabbath. Do y'all hear me? They were still at this point in history in the 1500s. We're talking about the entire country, not just a few Protestants like that are in Europe and like are in England. The entire country is keeping God's laws. The entire country. I mean, it should blow us all away, because, you know, it's history that we have never heard before. And so the emperor beat back the invaders. This was around 1543 that we're going to cover this. And then there's a history here. It's called the History of the Ethiopians. And you can see the credits here at the bottom. It says, this is a quote from this book on the history of Ethiopia. It came from the emperor in the 16th century named Claudius. And it says, we possess a confession of faith. He actually wrote a document about possessing confessing his faith. And this is what's written in this history book that he said. He said, Claudius said this Sabbath, he says, we do not keep as the Jews keep it, but we celebrate it by offering up the sacrament. Do y'all see that? So, you know, this is interesting, because in their history, they're recording that they were keeping the Sabbath. And they kept the holy days. And we're not talking about a few people now. We're talking about the entire nation of Ethiopia. The entire nation. And so we've never heard of this before, because nobody ever shares this history with us. I'm going to bring all this up so we can talk about this. Now, after the war, the Portuguese brought in the Jesuit priests that we talked about, and they're pretty dedicated in trying to change everybody to Catholicism. and they brought in the soldiers also. And the Ethiopians observed the seventh-day Sabbath, followed many biblical teachings, which we mentioned. And this, they actually had this priest. He was a Jesuit priest. His name was Corman. He wrote the history about this also. And this is what he said. See, this Jesuit priest, this is what he said. The Ethiopian Christians detest, abstain from pork, hare, which would be rabbits, and non-scaly fish. On the Sabbath, hunting, fishing, and traveling are forbidden. So this is what the Jesuit priest wrote about. So this is 2 records now that prove that these guys were keeping God's laws. And we're talking about the whole nation here. We're not talking about, individuals, a few people in Ethiopia. We're talking about the entire nation of Ethiopia. And this was the name of his book. It was called The Lost Empire, the story of the Jesuits in Ethiopia by Philip K. And this is the book where he wrote about how they kept the Sabbath. They didn't eat pork. They kept the unclean foods. And it's just fascinating, that they record this. And this was all done around the 15th and 16th centuries. All right, so now the emperor's name was Sassicius. He came to the point where he embraced the Catholic Church because there was this Jesuit that came and convinced him that he needed to change the entire landscape of Ethiopia and make it Catholic. So in 1622, look at the date here. They're keeping the Sabbath up to the 16th century here. He proclaimed the Catholic the official religion of the Ethiopian Empire. So this emperor decided that he was going to change everything to Catholicism. And everybody in Ethiopia was a true believer. Okay, now, he proclaimed Sunday the official day of worship in Ethiopia. He issued a proclamation requiring people to work on the Saturday Sabbath. Now, watch what happens here. Now, this is the history of Protestantism. This is done by James Wiley, and you can see the date. He was a Scottish historian, he actually recorded the history here. It says the emperor of Ethiopia was gained by flatteries and miracles, and a terrible persecution rose against the native Christians. Thousands were massacred. And so the Catholic priest was sent by the Catholic Church to be the religious leader in Ethiopia, which is what always happens. Now, Sassinius' son is Fasidi. And Fasidi was, like I said, one of the sons. And he came to his father and he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Look at what you've done. You divided the whole country up. Many people are getting killed. And you don't give them freedom to pick the religion they want. And you've turned the brothers against one another." And so they had to bring in Catholics out of Portugal to fight these people, because the people absolutely refused to give up their faith. They absolutely refused to death to give up their faith. And so it says, after the emperor heard what his son had to say, he said, I made a real big mistake here. And so he went back and he proclaimed to the people that they could worship however they wanted. And this was done in the 16th century. This was done in the 16th century. This, to me, this was one of the most incredible stories I have ever heard, because it wasn't just a few Protestants that were in Ethiopia. We're talking about the entire nation. And the entire nation stood up and said, "We're not going to have it. We're going to keep our holy days. We're going to keep our Sabbath. We were not going to work on Saturday. We're not going to submit to your rule. And they were willing to die for it. And so this is the history that has come down to us that nobody tells you, because nobody wants to tell you that all these people through the centuries were trying to keep God's laws and obey God. And people didn't tell that. And so this story is so amazing for us today, because we think we see the faith of these people, and in our minds we say to ourselves, we can't do this. Your mind just says, oh, I can't do this. But these people were not any stronger than us. They were not any stronger than us. The Father, at the time that they needed it, gave them the strength to do what they needed to do. He gave them the strength. And when things get tough in this country, and there's going to be another persecution, I'm sure of it, that he will give us the strength also to do the same thing. He will give us the strength. So, I'm going to close that out.
For more information about this broadcast, please visit our website at www.12tribehistory.com. That is the number 12, tribehistory.com, or email us at lwatson44@cox.net with any questions or comments.